Hi, I'm Celeste, and this is the moment I realized my own family saw me as nothing more than hired help. I was prepared for the usual cold shoulders and whispered comments at my sister's engagement party. But what I wasn't prepared for was being escorted to a table in the back corner with the catering staff, while my sister Viviana announced to 300 guests that I was just the help tonight. I wasn't a beloved sister. I wasn't family. I was an embarrassment. They needed to hide, and the worst part, my fiancé wasn't there to defend me because nobody knew he was coming, and nobody knew who he really was. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. For 28 years I had been the black sheep of the Rosewood family, while my sister Viviana glided through life with her perfectly manicured nails and designer everything. I chose a different path. I became a public defender in the rough neighborhoods of Camden Falls, representing people who couldn't afford fancy lawyers. My family never understood why I'd choose a dirty job helping those people, when I could have worked at our family's prestigious law firm Rosewood Associates. But tonight wasn't supposed to be about our differences. Tonight was supposed to be about celebrating Viviana's engagement to Theodore Ashworth III, heir to the Ashworth shipping fortune. The Ashworth family had old money, the kind that came with political connections, country club memberships, and the sort of social status that made my mother practically vibrate with excitement. This engagement wasn't just a union between two people, it was a merger between two of Camden Falls' most influential families. The venue was breathtaking. I'll give them that. The Rosewood estate had been transformed into something out of a fairy tale. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across the marble floors of our grand ballroom, while towering arrangements of white orchids and roses created an almost ethereal atmosphere. The guest list read like a who's who of Camden Falls society: judges, politicians, business moguls, and their perfectly polished wives, all dressed in their finest designer gowns and $1,000 suits. I had spent weeks preparing for this night, not because I was excited about Viviana's engagement, but because I knew it would be a minefield. My mother, Patricia Rosewood, had made it crystal clear that I needed to behave appropriately and not embarrass the family with any of your radical ideas. My father, Judge Harrison Rosewood, yes, a judge, the irony isn't lost on me, had simply warned me to keep things peaceful and remember what's at stake for the family's reputation. I had chosen my outfit carefully. A sophisticated navy blue dress that was elegant, but not attention-grabbing, paired with my grandmother's pearl necklace, the one piece of family jewelry I actually treasured. I thought if I looked apart, maybe they'd treat me like family for once. How naive I was. The evening started normally enough. I arrived fashionably on time, exchanged the obligatory air kisses with relatives I saw twice a year, and made small talk about everything except my actual work. Whenever someone asked about my career, I simply said I was in law and quickly changed the subject. I had learned that mentioning public defense work at these gatherings was like announcing you had a contagious disease. Viviana looked stunning, of course. She always did. Her engagement dress was a custom creation that probably cost more than most people's cars, and she wore it like she was born for this moment. Theodore stood beside her, playing the perfect devoted fiancé, though I noticed his eyes wandering to the other young women in the room more than once. But that wasn't my business. My job tonight was to smile, be pleasant, and try not to give my family any more reasons to be disappointed in me. The first sign of trouble came during cocktail hour. I was standing near the bar nursing a glass of champagne, when I overheard my Aunt Cordelia talking to Theodore's mother, Mrs. Ashworth. "Oh, that's just Celeste," Aunt Cordelia said dismissively. "She's the different one. Works with criminals, you know." Patricia tries to keep her busy so she doesn't cause problems at events like this. Mrs. Ashworth's eyebrows shot up. "Criminals? How unusual for a Rosewood. Well, every family has one, don't they?" Aunt Cordelia laughed. "At least she's not married yet." Patricia's hoping she'll come to her senses eventually. I felt my cheeks burn, but I forced myself to stay calm. This was nothing new. I'd been hearing variations of this conversation my entire adult life. But then dinner was announced, and that's when everything went completely sideways. The ballroom had been set with round tables for 10, each one adorned with place cards written in my mother's perfect calligraphy. I watched as guests found their seats, family at the head tables near the stage, important business associates and politicians scattered throughout the room in positions that reflected their social standing. It was like a carefully choreographed dance of status and influence. I looked for my name at the family tables first, then at the tables with family friends, then at the tables with business associates. Nothing. My stomach started to sink as I realized I was going to have to ask someone where I was supposed to sit. Finally, I approached one of the event coordinators, a young woman with a clipboard and a stressed expression. "Excuse me," I said politely. "I can't seem to find my place card. I'm Celeste Rosewood." She looked down at her clipboard, flipping through several pages. "Oh yes, here you are. Table 12. In the back." Table 12 turned out to be tucked away in the far corner of the ballroom, partially hidden behind a decorative column. As I approached, my heart sank even further. This wasn't a guest table at all. It was clearly the staff table, the place where the event coordinators, the photographer's assistants and other hired help would eat their meals during their breaks. But there was my place card, written in the same elegant script as all the others. Celeste Rose. I stood there for a moment, staring at that card, feeling the familiar sting of family rejection but on a level I'd never experienced before. They hadn't just excluded me from the important tables, they had literally seated me with the hired help. The message couldn't have been clearer if they'd tattooed it on my forehead. "You don't belong with us." What I didn't know was that in exactly 37 minutes, my fiancé Daniel would walk through those ballroom doors, and everything, absolutely everything, was about to change. Because while my family saw me as an embarrassment, the rest of Camden Falls was about to discover that I was engaged to Judge Daniel Cross, the youngest federal judge in the state's history, and the man who would be presiding over the biggest corruption trial this city had ever seen. A trial that would destroy some very powerful people, including some of the people in this very room. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The Rosewood estate had been transformed into a showcase of wealth and power that evening, every detail meticulously planned to impress Camden Falls' most influential family. As I stood in that corner staring at my place card among the hired help, I couldn't help but take in the sheer magnitude of what my family had orchestrated. The ballroom itself was a monument to old money elegance. Soaring 20-foot ceilings adorned with hand-painted murals, depicting scenes from European gardens, created an atmosphere of timeless sophistication. The marble floors, imported from Italy 3 generations ago, reflected the warm glow of 6 massive crystal chandeliers that had been in the Rosewood family since 8. Tonight, they cast dancing patterns of light across walls, lined with original oil paintings worth more than most people's houses. But it wasn't just the physical beauty that made this room intimidating, it was the people filling it. These weren't just wealthy individuals, these were the puppet masters of Camden Falls. Every conversation happening around me represented millions of dollars in business deals, political favors and social maneuvering. The air itself seemed thick with the weight of influence and expectation. At the head table, positioned on a slightly raised platform so everyone could see them, sat Viviana and Theodore with their respective families. My sister looked absolutely radiant in her custom Valentino gown, a creation that had required 3 fittings and cost more than I made in 6 months. Her hair was styled in an intricate updo that had taken her hairstylist 4 hours to perfect, and the engagement ring on her finger, a 5-carat diamond surrounded by sapphires, caught the light every time she gestured, which she did frequently and deliberately. Theodore, for his part, played the role of devoted fiancé perfectly, tall, blonde, and classically handsome, in that effortless way that comes from generations of good breeding and better nutrition. He possessed the kind of confident charm that made everyone want to be near him. His family's shipping empire had built half the ports on the East Coast, and his trust fund was reportedly worth more than some small country's GDP. He was, by every measure that mattered to families like ours, the perfect cat. The guest list read like a directory of power in Camden Falls and beyond. Senator Richard Blackstone sat 3 tables away, deep in conversation with Mayor Catherine Willis, about the upcoming infrastructure bill that would benefit both their interests. Corporate attorney James Hartwell, known for getting white-collar criminals acquitted on technicalities, was regaling a table of business owners with stories that had them all laughing a little too loudly. Judge Margaret Fairchild, one of the most senior judges in the state, held court at her table like the legal royalty she was considered to be. These weren't just successful people, they were the architects of Camden Falls' power structure. Every zoning decision, every major business deal, every political appointment, somehow traced back to the relationships being maintained and cultivated in this very room. The charity galas, country club memberships and exclusive social events weren't just entertainment, they were the venues where the real business of running the city got done. And then there was my family's position in all of this. The Rosewood name carried weight in Camden Falls, not just because of our wealth, but because of our influence in the legal community. My father, Judge Harrison Rosewood, had been on the state Supreme Court for 15 years, and was rumored to be under consideration for federal appointment. Our law firm Rosewood Associates represented half the major corporations in the state, and had a reputation for making problems disappear with the right combination of legal maneuvering and strategic relationships. My mother, Patricia, was equally formidable in her own sphere. She chaired the boards of 3 major charities, organized the city's most exclusive social events, and wielded social influence, like a surgeon wielded a scalpel, precisely and with devastating effect. When Patricia Rosewood decided someone was persona non grata in Camden Falls society, they might as well move to another state. This was the world I had grown up in, the world I was expected to embrace and contribute to. Every summer of my childhood had been spent at the country club, every holiday at carefully orchestrated family gatherings designed to reinforce our position in the social hierarchy. I had been groomed from birth to marry well, join the family firm, and continue the Rosewood legacy of wealth, influence and social dominance, but I had chosen differently, and that choice had made me a problem they didn't know how to solve. When I graduated from law school summa cum laude from Columbia, the same school where my father and grandfather had studied, the expectation was that I would join Rosewood Associates and begin my ascent through the ranks of Camden Falls legal elite. Instead, I shocked everyone by taking a job with the public defender's office, representing defendants who couldn't afford private counsel. It's just a phase, my mother had told her friends. She's young and idealistic. She'll come to her senses. But 5 years later I was still there, still fighting for people that my family's social circle believed deserved whatever punishment they received. I had handled drug cases, domestic violence cases, and white-collar crime cases that sometimes put me directly at odds with the interests of people sitting in this very ballroom. The disconnect was jarring. Here I was, surrounded by luxury that most people could only dream of, watching my family celebrate an engagement that would further cement their position among Camden Falls elite, while tomorrow I would be back in a cramped courthouse defending a single mother accused of welfare fraud or a teenager caught with marijuana. As I stood there taking in the opulent scene around me, I noticed the carefully orchestrated nature of everything. The seating arrangements weren't random. They were strategic. Business partners were seated near each other, potential allies were introduced through shared tables, and social hierarchies were reinforced through proximity to the head table. Even the staff movements were choreographed, with servers who had clearly been briefed on who warranted extra attention, and who could be served efficiently and forgotten. This was power in action, I realized. Not the obvious, heavy-handed kind, but the subtle, pervasive influence that shaped lives and communities through relationships, expectations, and unspoken understanding. The kind of power that could make someone disappear from consideration for jobs, loans or social acceptance without anyone ever having to explicitly state what was happening. And I was watching it all from the staff table, officially excluded from the inner circle of the family that shared my DNA. But not my values. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. In their eyes I had chosen to serve a different master, and now I would literally sit with the other servants. What none of them knew was that in less than half an hour the balance of power in this room was about to shift dramatically. Because while they saw me as a misguided idealist playing with criminals, I was actually engaged to the one person in Camden Falls with the authority to hold all of them accountable for their carefully hidden sins. The federal corruption investigation, that had been quietly building for months was about to explode into public view, and some of the most powerful people in this room were about to discover that their protection wasn't as absolute as they believed. Standing at my assigned table in the corner, I had the perfect vantage point to observe the intricate social choreography playing out before me. From this position, I could see exactly who wielded power and how they used it, knowledge that would prove more valuable than I could have imagined. Viviana commanded attention effortlessly from the head table, but it wasn't just her stunning appearance that drew people to her. My sister had always possessed an innate understanding of social manipulation that bordered on genius. She could make someone feel like the most important person in the world with a single smile, then destroy their confidence with an equally brilliant dismissal. Tonight she was in her element, graciously accepting congratulations while subtly directing conversations toward topics that benefited her and Theodore's future plans. Celeste's work is so noble, I heard her tell Miss Eleanor Ashworth, Theodore's mother, when my name inevitably came up in conversation. The way she said noble made it sound like a terminal illness. She's always been driven to help the less fortunate. We're so proud of her dedication to charity work. Miss Ashworth, a woman whose family had built their fortune in shipping and had maintained their social position through 3 generations of strategic marriages, nodded with the kind of polite understanding that wealthy women perfected. How admirable. Though I imagine it must be quite draining, dealing with those sorts of people day after day. Oh, it is, Viviana agreed, touching Mrs. Ashworth's arm in a gesture of shared sympathy. But Celeste has always been our little crusader. We just hope she finds balance eventually. Perhaps with the right influence. She let the implication hang in the air, suggesting that my career was just a phase that would end with proper guidance. Theodore, meanwhile, was working the room with the practiced ease of someone born to privilege. Unlike many trust fund babies who coasted on their family's reputation, Theodore had actually shown business acumen, expanding the Ashworth shipping interests into new markets and technology. But what made him truly dangerous was his ability to make everyone feel like his best friend while revealing absolutely nothing about himself. I watched him charm Judge Fairchild with questions about her recent rulings, express genuine interest in Senator Blackstone's infrastructure proposals, and somehow make corporate attorney James Hartwell laugh at jokes that probably weren't that fun. Theodore understood that power wasn't just about what you could do, it was about who owed you favors and who wanted to be in your good graces. My father, Judge Harrison Rosewood, held court at a table strategically positioned to allow him to observe the entire room while appearing relaxed and social. At 62, he still commanded respect through sheer presence. His silver hair and distinguished bearing made him look like Central Casting's idea of a federal judge, but his mind was sharp as a razor. He had built his career on being scrupulously fair in public while maintaining relationships that ensured his continued advancement. Tonight, he was deep in conversation with District Attorney Robert Crane, an ambitious prosecutor who had built his reputation on high-profile convictions and had his sights set on the governor's mansion. They appeared to be discussing golf, but I knew my father well enough to recognize when he was conducting business disguised as social conversation. The Pinehurst course has really improved since the renovation, Dia Crane was saying, but his tone suggested they weren't really talking about golf greens. Indeed, my father replied, though some changes take time to show their full impact, patience and the right approach are essential. I had heard similar coded conversations my entire life. In our world, direct discussion of quid pro quo arrangements was crude. Instead, business was conducted through metaphors, implications, and carefully worded suggestions that could be denied if necessary. My mother, Patricia, was orchestrating the social dynamics with the precision of a conductor leading a symphony. She moved gracefully between tables, ensuring that important introductions were made, potential conflicts were smoothed over, and everyone felt appropriately valued according to their position in the hierarchy. But her real skill was in information gathering. Patricia had an uncanny ability to extract secrets during casual conversation, filing away details about family problems, business difficulties and personal indiscretions that could prove useful later. She never used this information maliciously, at least not obviously, but her comprehensive knowledge of everyone's vulnerabilities made her one of the most influential in Camden Falls. Celeste, darling, she said, suddenly appearing at my table with Mayor Catherine Willis in tow. I was just telling Catherine about your work with the underprivileged. Catherine, this is my younger daughter, the one I mentioned who works in public service. Mayor Willis, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who had clawed her way to political power through a combination of genuine reform efforts and strategic compromises, extended her hand with professional courtesy. How nice to meet you, Celeste. Your mother says you're making quite a difference in the community. The conversation was polite but brief, just long enough for my mother to demonstrate that she hadn't completely disowned me while making it clear that I occupied a different sphere from the other guests. Mayor Willis's attention was clearly divided, her eyes scanning the room for more strategically valuable conversation. As they moved away, I caught a glimpse of another power player who made my stomach tighten. Attorney James Hartwell, the man known for getting wealthy defendants acquitted on technicalities. Hartwell specialized in white-collar crime defense, and his client list read like a who's who of Camden Falls business elite. He had a reputation for finding loopholes, discrediting witnesses, and making evidence disappear through legal maneuvering. What made Hartwell particularly dangerous was his charm. Unlike the stereotypical sleazy defense attorney, he was genuinely likable, funny, and appeared to care deeply about justice. He donated generously to charity, served on nonprofit boards, and gave compelling speeches about the importance of protecting constitutional rights. He was the kind of lawyer who could convince a jury that his guilty client was actually the victim. Tonight he was regaling a table with stories that had everyone laughing, but I noticed how carefully he chose his audience. The people at his table included several business owners who had faced regulatory investigations, a city council member who had been questioned about zoning decisions, and a real estate developer whose projects always seemed to get approved despite environmental concern. Then there was Judge Margaret Fairchild, the senior state court judge, whose decisions had shaped Camden Falls' legal landscape for over 2 decades. Judge Fairchild was respected, feared, and absolutely incorruptible, or so everyone believed. She had built her reputation on harsh sentences for street crimes while showing surprising leniency toward white-collar offenses, explaining that prison should be reserved for violent criminals who posed a genuine threat to society. Her philosophy sounded reasonable in principle, but the practical effect was that drug dealers and burglars went to prison while embezzlers and tax evaders got probation and community service. She had never been accused of bias or corruption because her decisions always had legal justification, but the pattern was unmistakable to anyone who cared to look. As I observed these power dynamics playing out, I realized that my position at the staff table wasn't just humiliating, it was enlightening. From here I could see the entire ecosystem of influence and corruption that shaped Camden Falls. I could watch how deals were made, how pressure was applied, and how the powerful protected each other while maintaining plausible deniability. What none of them knew was that every conversation I was overhearing, every interaction I was witnessing, was potentially evidence in the federal corruption investigation that my fiancé would soon be overseeing. The same people who saw me as an embarrassing idealist were about to discover that I was engaged to the one person with the power to bring their carefully constructed world crashing down. But for now, they continued their elaborate dance of power and privilege, completely unaware that their performance was being observed by someone who finally had the means to hold them accountable. The first course had been served, a delicate lobster bisque that probably cost more per bowl than my clients made in a day, when the subtle attacks began in earnest. From my corner table I watched as the evening's true entertainment unfolded, the systematic demolition of my reputation and character, orchestrated with the precision of a military campaign. It started with Dr. Amanda Sterling, Theodore's aunt, and a prominent psychiatrist who specialized in treating the wealthy and troubled. She had positioned herself at a table within earshot of mine, and her voice carried just enough for me to hear every word while maintaining plausible deniability. "I worry about young people today," Dr. Sterling was saying to her dinner companions, her tone dripping with professional concern. "This generation seems to think that rebellion against family values is somehow noble. Take Celeste, for instance." She gestured discreetly in my direction. "Such a bright girl, but clearly struggling with some deep-seated need to reject everything her family represents. It's textbook oppositional defiant behavior. Her companions, a mix of society wives and business leaders, nodded with the kind of grave understanding that people display when discussing someone else's mental health. The beauty of Dr. Sterling's approach was that she never said anything technically cruel or untrue. She simply applied her professional expertise to pathologize my life choices, making my career in public defense sound like a psychological disorder rather than a moral commitment. "Is it true she represents drug dealers?" asked Miss Caroline Whitfield, the wife of a pharmaceutical company executive. Her question was posed with the kind of horrified fascination usually reserved for discussions of exotic diseases. Among others, Dr. Sterling replied sadly, "Patricia tells me she's even defended people accused of assault." Imagine the psychological toll of surrounding yourself with violence and criminality day after day. It changes a person, makes them suspicious of decent society. The implication was clear: my work hadn't just made me difficult, it had damaged me psychologically, making me unfit for polite company. It was a brilliant character assassination because it positioned their rejection of me as concern for my well-being rather than snobbery. Meanwhile, at the table adjacent to theirs, Theodore's business partner William Cromwell was holding forth on the topic of idealism versus practicality. Cromwell owned a construction company that had secured most of the major municipal contracts in Camden Falls over the past decade, despite consistently submitting bids that weren't the low. "The problem with bleeding hearts," Cromwell was explaining to his audience, "is that they think good intentions matter more than results. Take public defenders. They'll fight tooth and nail to get some career criminal back on the streets, then act surprised when he commits another crime. Meanwhile, the victims suffer because someone thought feeling good about themselves was more important than protecting society." His wife, a former debutante who had married into construction money, nodded enthusiastically. "Exactly. It's like they care more about criminals than law-abiding citizens. How is that justice?" The conversation was clearly intended for my benefit, designed to make me feel defensive about my work while appearing to be a general philosophical discussion. Cromwell's timing was perfect. Just as the lobster bisque was being cleared and conversation naturally turned to weightier topics, but the real masterpiece came from Judge Fairchild herself, who had somehow maneuvered the conversation at her table toward the topic of legal ethics. Her voice, trained by decades of courtroom projection, carried clearly across the ballroom. "The challenge facing our justice system," she was saying, "isn't a lack of compassion, it's a surplus of misguided sympathy. When lawyers prioritize their emotional satisfaction over their professional judgment, everyone suffers. I've seen too many cases where defense attorneys became so personally invested in their clients that they lost sight of the bigger picture." She paused to sip her wine, allowing her words to sink in before continuing. "True legal excellence requires emotional distance. The moment you start seeing criminals as victims of society rather than individuals responsible for their choices, you've compromised your ability to serve justice effectively." The beauty of Judge Fairchild's commentary was its apparent objectivity. She wasn't attacking me personally, she was simply sharing her judicial wisdom about the legal profession, but everyone in the room understood the subtext. I was an emotionally compromised lawyer whose personal feelings interfered with my professional judgment. As the second course arrived, seared duck breast with cherry reduction, the attacks became more coordinated. I realized this wasn't spontaneous social conversation, it was a carefully orchestrated campaign designed to isolate me and justify my exclusion from family events. Senator Blackstone, positioned at a power table near the front of the room, began discussing the burden that ineffective public defenders placed on the taxpayer. "We spend millions funding lawyers who view their role as social workers rather than advocates," he declared to his table of political donors and business leaders. "They drag out cases with frivolous motions, waste court time with emotional appeals, and cost the state a fortune in extended proceedings." His critique was particularly stinging because it contained just enough truth to sound credible. Public defender offices were chronically underfunded and overworked, which did sometimes result in cases taking longer than they might in private practice. But Senator Blackstone framed this systemic problem as a character flaw of the lawyers involved, suggesting that we were deliberately wasting taxpayer money. Mayor Willis, not to be outdone, added her own perspective on urban crime and defense attorneys who enabled criminal behavior through excessive advocacy. Her comments were especially painful because I had genuinely respected her reform efforts and had hoped she might understand the complexities of criminal justice work. The problem, Mayor Willis explained to her rapt audience, is that some lawyers become so focused on technical defenses that they lose sight of community safety. They'll get someone off on a technicality, then wash their hands of responsibility when that person commits another crime. The irony was breathtaking. These people, who had spent their careers manipulating the system for their own benefit, who had turned public service into personal enrichment, who had corrupted the very institutions they claimed to protect, were lecturing me about professional ethics and community respect. But the evening's pièce de résistance came from my own mother, who had positioned herself at a table with several prominent charity board members. Patricia had waited until the conversation naturally turned to volunteerism and community service before delivering her masterstroke. "I'm so proud of all my children's commitment to service," she began, her tone warm and maternal. "Viviana's work with the Children's Hospital Foundation has raised over $2 million for pediatric care, and Theodore's environmental initiatives have been transformative for waterfront development." She paused, allowing the accomplishments of Viviana and Theodore to sink in before continuing with a slight shift in tone. "And Celeste, bless her heart, has always been drawn to helping those who can't help themselves. It's admirable, really, though sometimes I worry that she's taken on more than she can handle. The emotional burden of that work, well, it's changed her. She's become quite isolated from family and friends who want to support her." The genius of my mother's approach was that she positioned herself as the loving, concerned parent while suggesting that I had become emotionally unstable and antisocial due to my work. She managed to express pride in my career while simultaneously undermining my mental health and social fitness. As I sat there, methodically eating my duck while listening to my character being systematically destroyed by people who had never spent a day fighting for justice, I felt something shift inside me. The familiar sting of family rejection was evolving into something else, a cold, clear anger that burned away any lingering desire to earn their approval. They thought they were punishing me for my career choices, but they were actually revealing their own moral bankruptcy. Every criticism they leveled at my work was projection. Every attack on my character was confession of their own corruption. What they didn't know was that in less than 20 minutes, their carefully orchestrated character assassination would become the least of their problems. Because while they had been busy destroying my reputation, federal investigators had been busy building cases against half the people in this room, and the judge who would be presiding over those cases was about to walk through the ballroom door. The main course was being cleared when Viviana rose from her seat at the head table, champagne flute in hand, ready to deliver what I assumed would be a gracious thank you speech to the assembled guests. The conversations died down as 300 of Camden Falls's most influential people turned their attention to the bride-to-be, their faces reflecting the warm anticipation that comes with witnessing a perfect moment in a perfect life. Viviana looked absolutely radiant as she waited for complete silence, her emerald silk gown catching the light from the chandeliers above. She had always possessed an innate sense of timing, knowing exactly when to speak and when to pause for maximum impact. Tonight was no different. "Thank you all so much for being here to celebrate this incredible milestone with Theodore and me," she began, her voice carrying clearly across the ballroom without seeming forced or artificial. "When I look around this room, I see not just our friends and family but the very heart of Camden Falls, the people who make our community strong, prosperous, and beautiful." The guests smiled and nodded, basking in the recognition of their importance. This was exactly the kind of validation they expected at events like this, acknowledgement of their status and contributions to society. "Theodore and I are so grateful for the love and support you've shown us, and we're excited to build our future surrounded by people who share our values and commitment to excellence." Viviana paused, her eyes scanning the room with practiced grace. "Of course, planning an event like this requires an enormous amount of help, and I want to take a moment to thank the people who made tonight possible." I felt a strange prickle of unease, though I couldn't immediately identify why. Something in Viviana's tone had shifted almost imperceptibly, taking on the quality of a teacher addressing a classroom rather than a bride thanking her guests. "First, I want to thank our incredible catering team," she continued, gesturing toward the staff who had lined up along the wall. "They've worked tirelessly to create this beautiful evening, and I hope you'll all join me in showing your appreciation." Polite applause rippled through the room as the guests turned to acknowledge the servers, bartenders, and kitchen staff. It was a nice gesture, the kind of gracious recognition that separated truly elegant people from merely wealthy ones. I also want to thank our event coordinator, Caroline, who somehow managed to handle every detail, including some very last-minute changes to our seating arrangement. Viviana's smile brightened as if she were sharing a delightful inside joke. "You know how families are. There's always someone who doesn't quite fit the original plan." The unease I'd been feeling crystallized into something approaching dread. Viviana's tone remained light and celebratory, but there was something predatory in her expression now, like a cat that had been playing with a mouse and was ready to deliver the killing blow. "Speaking of family," she continued, "I want to take a special moment to acknowledge someone who's been working so hard tonight that many of you might not have even noticed her." My stomach dropped as I realized where this was heading, but I was powerless to stop it. 300 pairs of eyes were focused on Viviana, hanging on her every word, and I could only sit frozen in my corner as she prepared to destroy what remained of my dignity. "My sister Celeste has been absolutely invaluable tonight," Viviana announced, her voice filled with theatrical warmth. "She insisted on helping with the event in a more hands-on capacity than we originally planned. In fact, she's been so dedicated to serving our guests that we decided to seat her with our wonderful catering staff so she could better coordinate their effort." The silence that followed was deafening. I could feel the exact moment when 300 of Camden Falls' most powerful people turned to look at me, their expressions shifting from confusion to understanding to barely concealed amusement. The joke wasn't just that I had been seated with the staff, it was that my own sister had publicly announced it as a deliberate choice, positioning my humiliation as volunteer service. "Please join me in thanking Celeste for her commitment to making sure everyone has a wonderful evening," Viviana concluded, raising her champagne flute in my direction. "She's always been our little helper, and tonight she's really outdone herself." The applause that followed was the most humiliating sound I had ever heard. It wasn't the warm appreciation shown to the actual catering staff. It was the kind of condescending acknowledgement given to a child who had tried very hard but ultimately failed. Some guests clapped enthusiastically, clearly entertained by the spectacle. Others offered polite, uncomfortable applause while avoiding eye contact with me. A few, particularly those who had children my age, looked genuinely disturbed by the cruelty of what they were witnessing. But what destroyed me wasn't the applause itself, it was seeing the faces of the people I had grown up with, people who had known me since childhood, as they processed what Viviana had just revealed about my place in the family hierarchy. Judge Fairchild's expression showed professional interest, as if she were observing a fascinating social experiment. Senator Blackstone looked satisfied, his earlier criticism of my work now validated by my obvious family dysfunction. Mayor Willis appeared uncomfortable but made no move to object to what was happening, and my parents. My father maintained his judicial composure, his face revealing nothing as he continued to cut his meat with mechanical precision. My mother smiled serenely, as if her daughter publicly humiliating her other daughter was exactly what she had expected and perhaps hoped for. The actual catering staff looked mortified on my behalf, clearly recognizing that I was being used as a prop in some twisted family drama. One young server, a woman about my age with kind eyes, mouthed, "I'm sorry," when she caught my attention. Her genuine sympathy from a complete stranger was somehow more painful than the calculated cruelty from my own family. As the applause died down and conversations resumed, I remained frozen in my chair, staring at the remnants of my dinner. The duck breast had gone cold, the cherry reduction congealed on the plate like drops of blood. My hands trembled slightly as I reached for my water glass, trying to process what had just happened. Viviana had done more than humiliate me. She had publicly defined my role in the family and by extension in Camden Falls society. I wasn't the black sheep daughter who had chosen a different path, I was the family servant, someone whose function was to facilitate other people's success rather than achieve any of my own. She had transformed my exclusion from the main tables into evidence of my willingness to serve, my isolation into proof of my utility. The genius of her approach was that it made any protest on my part seem ungrateful and petty. If I stood up and objected, I would be seen as someone who couldn't graciously accept recognition for my service. If I remained silent, I was accepting the role she had assigned me. Either way, she had won. But what Viviana had fundamentally miscalculated was assuming that this humiliation would break me the way it might have 5 years ago when I still desperately wanted their approval. What she didn't realize was that by making my outsider status so explicit and so public, she had actually liberated me from any remaining desire to be accepted by these people. As I sat there listening to the resumed conversations and watching the comfortable return to their evening's entertainment, I felt something shift inside me. The hurt was still there, sharp and immediate, but underneath it was something else, a cold, clear certainty that I was done playing their game. I had spent years trying to bridge two worlds, maintaining relationships with a family that saw me as an embarrassment while building a career fighting for people they considered disposable. Tonight had shown me that the bridge was an illusion. There was no middle ground between their values and mine, no compromise that would satisfy both my conscience and their expectation. What none of them knew was that in exactly 12 minutes, their perfect evening was about to be shattered by the arrival of someone who would force them to confront the consequences of their carefully hidden corruption. And when that moment came, I would no longer be the embarrassing family member desperate for acceptance. I would be the woman engaged to the federal judge who held their fate in his hands. I stood up slowly, my chair scraping against the marble floor with a sound that seemed to echo through the ballroom despite the ongoing conversations around me. The decision crystallized in that moment, not just to leave, but to stop pretending that I belonged in a world that had just made it abundantly clear I never would. The actual catering staff looked at me with genuine concern as I moved away from their table. Maria, the server who had mouthed her apology earlier, stepped forward slightly as if to help, but I shook my head gently. This wasn't about them, and I wouldn't drag innocent people into whatever was about to unfold. I walked deliberately toward the head table, my heels clicking against the marble in a steady rhythm that seemed to match my heartbeat. Conversations gradually quieted as guests noticed my movement, perhaps expecting me to deliver some gracious thank you speech in response to Viviana's recognition of my service. Viviana saw me coming and her smile widened, clearly anticipating either a grateful acceptance of her characterization or an embarrassing outburst that would further cement my status as the unstable family member. Theodore leaned back in his chair with the satisfied expression of someone watching entertainment he hadn't had to pay for. When I reached the head table, I didn't stop to address the crowd or make a speech. Instead, I reached into my small evening purse and pulled out my phone. The simple action seemed to freeze everyone at the table. My parents, Viviana, Theodore, and the Ashworths, all staring at me with varying degrees of confusion and concern. "What are you doing, Celeste?" my mother asked quietly, her voice carrying the warning tone I remembered from childhood when I was about to do something that would reflect poorly on the family. I looked at her for a long moment, then at my father, whose judicial composure was beginning to crack around the edge. Finally, I turned to Viviana, who was no longer smiling. "I'm making a phone call," I said calmly, my voice carrying clearly in the sudden hush that had fallen over our section of the ballroom. I scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I was looking for, then pressed call. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times before a familiar voice answered. "Daniel Cross." "Hi, it's me," I said, never taking my eyes off Viviana's face. "Are you still planning to pick me up, or would you prefer to meet me here?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, and I could hear the sound of a car door closing. "I'm actually just pulling into the valet area now. Is everything all right? You sound—" "Everything's fine," I interrupted, watching as comprehension began to dawn on the faces around me. "I just think it's time for you to meet my family properly, all of them." Another pause, longer this time. Daniel knew me well enough to recognize when something significant was happening. Should I be concerned about anything specific? I looked around the table, taking in the increasingly worried expressions of people who were just beginning to realize they might have made a terrible miscalculation. "Just be yourself." Judge Daniel Cross, youngest federal judge in state history, recently assigned to oversee the Camden Falls corruption investigation. I think some of the people here will be very interested to meet you. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the background conversations at nearby tables seemed to fade as the implications of what I had just said sank in. Judge Harrison Rosewood's face had gone completely white. Theodore's smug expression had transformed into something approaching panic. My mother's carefully maintained composure cracked entirely, her champagne flute trembling in her hand, but it was Viviana's reaction that satisfied me most. The sister who had just publicly humiliated me, who had reduced me to a servant in front of 300 people, was staring at me with the dawning horror of someone who had just realized they had catastrophically underestimated their opponent. "That's impossible," she whispered. You can't be." Engaged to Federal Judge Daniel Cross, I finished for her, the man who will be presiding over the corruption trials that are about to reshape Camden Falls' power structure. Actually, have been for 8 months now. I ended the call and slipped my phone back into my purse, then looked around the table with the kind of calm confidence I had never been able to summon in this room before. "He should be here in about 3 minutes, I think some of you might want to use that time to consider how you'd like to introduce yourselves to the federal judge who has been reviewing evidence of corruption in city contracts, zoning decisions, and judicial proceedings for the past 6 months. The effect was immediate and devastating. Theodore pushed back from the table so abruptly that his chair nearly toppled over. Mrs. Ashworth grabbed her husband's arm with white-knuckled fingers. My father looked like he was having difficulty breathing. "Celeste," my mother began, her voice barely above a whisper, "surely you're not suggesting that your relationship would in any way influence a federal judge's professional decisions?" I completed her thought. "Of course not, Mother. That would be unethical. But I am suggesting that the people in this room might want to reconsider their assumptions about who has power and who doesn't." The ripple effect spread outward from our table as guests noticed the commotion and began straining to hear what was happening. I could see Judge Fairchild leaning forward in her chair, her judicial instincts alerting her to significant developments. Senator Blackstone was watching us with the focused attention of a politician sensing either opportunity or danger. "You planned this," Viviana accused, her voice shaking with fury and fear. "You've been planning this entire time to what?" I asked, genuinely curious about how she planned to finish that sentence. "To fall in love with someone who happens to have the authority to investigate corruption. To keep my personal life private until my own family decided to publicly humiliate me. To protect the man I love from exactly the kind of social pressure and manipulation that's been on display here tonight." The truth was that I hadn't planned any of this. Daniel and I had agreed to keep our relationship quiet precisely because we both understood the complications it could create in a city where business, politics, and law were so intertwined. We had been scrupulously careful to avoid any situation where his position might be compromised or my work might be questioned, but watching my family's performance tonight had clarified something for me. The corruption in Camden Falls wasn't just about money or political favor. It was about a system that allowed people like my family to destroy anyone who threatened their control, to use social pressure and economic influence to maintain their position at the top of the hierarchy. "The question you should be asking yourselves," I continued, looking around the table at people who had spent their entire lives believing they were untouchable, "is whether you want to spend the next few minutes figuring out how to explain your behavior tonight to a federal judge, or whether you'd prefer to pretend this conversation never happened, and hope he doesn't notice how you've been treating the woman he loves." Through the ballroom's tall windows, I could see valet attendants moving efficiently around the circular drive. Any moment now, Daniel would walk through those doors, and these people would have to confront the reality that their carefully constructed world was about to be subjected to federal scrutiny by someone who couldn't be bought, influenced, or intimidated. Someone who loved me enough to support my career fighting for justice, even when it put us both in difficult positions. Someone who was about to discover exactly how Camden Falls's elite treated people they considered beneath them. The double doors at the ballroom's entrance opened, and Daniel Cross stepped inside. Daniel Cross entered the ballroom with the quiet confidence that had first attracted me to him 3 years ago. At 38, he possessed the rare combination of intellectual authority and approachable warmth that made him effective both in courtrooms and social situations. Tonight, Dressed in an impeccably tailored black suit with a subtle silver tie, he looked every inch the federal judge he was. But more importantly to me, he looked like the man who had spent countless evenings listening to me vent about the very people who were now staring at him in barely concealed terror. The transformation in the ballroom was immediate and electric. Conversations that had been flowing naturally moments before stuttered to awkward stops as guests turned to observe the new arrival. But this wasn't the curious attention typically paid to late arriving guests. This was the focused scrutiny of people trying to assess a potential threat. Daniel's eyes swept the room with the practiced observation of someone trained to read people and situations quickly. When his gaze found mine at the head table, his expression shifted from polite social alertness to concerned recognition. He had seen me in difficult family situations before, and he could clearly tell that tonight had been particularly challenging. He moved toward me with purposeful strides, nodding politely to guests who tried to intercept him, but not stopping to engage in conversation. As he approached our table, I watched the faces of my family members cycle through a fascinating range of emotions: panic, calculation, desperate hope that this might all be some elaborate joke, and the dawning realization that their world had just shifted fundamentally. "Celeste," Daniel said warmly as he reached me, leaning down to kiss my cheek in a gesture so natural and affectionate that it spoke of genuine intimacy. "I'm sorry I'm late." The traffic from the courthouse was worse than expected. The word courthouse hung in the air like a small explosion. Several guests at nearby tables had clearly overheard, and I could see the information being processed and shared through glances and whispered comments. "Daniel," I said, taking his hand and drawing him closer to the table, "I'd like you to meet my family. This is my sister Viviana, her fiancé, Theodore Ashworth, my parents Patricia and Judge Harrison Rosewood, and Theodore's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ashworth." Daniel's smile was professionally pleasant as he extended his hand first to my father. "Judge Rosewood, it's an honor to meet you. I've read several of your state Supreme Court decisions, particularly your ruling on municipal bond oversight. Very insightful legal reasoning." My father's handshake was noticeably limp, and his usual judicial composure was nowhere to be found. "Judge Cross," he managed, his voice slightly hoarse. We didn't realize that that you and she were engaged," Daniel finished smoothly, his tone remaining warm and conversational. "Yes, we've been keeping it relatively quiet while we both navigate some complex professional situations. You understand how it is in our field, appearance of impropriety and all that." The phrase "appearance of impropriety" landed like a legal grenade among people who had spent their careers carefully managing exactly such appearances. Theodore had gone pale beneath his country club tan, while his mother clutched her pearls with white knuckles. Daniel turned to Viviana with the same professional courtesy. "Congratulations on your engagement. Celeste has told me so much about you." His tone was perfectly neutral, but I caught the slight emphasis on "so much" that suggested the information shared had not been entirely flattering. Viviana, to her credit, managed to find her voice, though it came out higher than usual. "Thank you, Judge Cross. We're so surprised. Celeste never mentioned she was seeing anyone, let alone a federal judge overseeing corruption investigations in Camden Falls," I supplied helpfully. "I know it's quite a coincidence, isn't it? Daniel's been working so hard on building cases against municipal corruption, judicial misconduct, and bid-rigging schemes. Sometimes he comes home just exhausted from reviewing all the evidence." The effect of my words was like watching dominoes fall. Theodore actually stepped backward, bumping into a server who was trying to clear plates. Mrs. Ashworth made a small gasping sound. Judge Fairchild, who had been approaching our table with obvious curiosity, stopped mid-stride as if she had hit an invisible wall. Daniel squeezed my hand gently, a warning to be careful, but not a request to stop. He understood exactly what was happening and why I had chosen this moment to reveal our relationship. "The work has been challenging," he agreed, his judicial training allowing him to navigate the conversation without saying anything that could be construed as inappropriate. "There's been quite a bit of cooperation from various agencies. The FBI's white-collar crime unit has been particularly thorough in their evidence gathering. Mayor Willis, who had been moving closer to our conversation, suddenly found urgent business at the opposite end of the ballroom. Senator Blackstone was deep in animated conversation with his chief of staff, their body language suggesting emergency damage control. Attorney James Hartwell had disappeared entirely. I hadn't seen him leave, but his table was conspicuously empty. "Daniel," my mother said, her social training finally overriding her panic. "What a lovely surprise. You must join us for dinner. I'm sure we can arrange another place setting." It was a masterful recovery attempt. By extending hospitality, she was trying to regain control of the situation and demonstrate that the family had nothing to hide, but Daniel's response was equally masterful. "Thank you, Mrs. Rosewood, but I'm afraid I can't stay long. I have an early morning tomorrow. We're starting jury selection for a major case, multiple defendants, very complex charges." He paused, looking around the ballroom with apparent appreciation. "What a beautiful event, though, and such an impressive guest list." I recognized several names from various investigations. The silence that followed was deafening. Daniel hadn't accused anyone of anything, hadn't even implied wrongdoing. He had simply acknowledged that he recognized some of the guests, and in doing so had transformed the entire dynamic of the evening. Sterling, who had spent earlier portions of the evening questioning my mental health, was now studying Daniel with the intensity of someone trying to read tea leaves. William Cromwell, the construction contractor who had criticized my idealism, was having what appeared to be an urgent phone conversation near the bar. But the most fascinating transformation was in Viviana herself. The sister who had publicly humiliated me less than 30 minutes ago was now looking at me with something approaching awe, not respect. She wasn't capable of that, but a recognition that she had fundamentally miscalculated my position in the power structure she cared so much about. "Celeste," she said carefully, "perhaps we could speak privately for a moment." Daniel looked at me with raised eyebrows, clearly curious about how I wanted to handle the situation. The old Celeste would have agreed immediately, eager for any sign that my family wanted to repair our relationship. But that woman had died somewhere between being seated at the staff table and watching my sister turn my exclusion into entertainment. "I think we've said everything that needs to be said publicly," I replied, emphasizing the last word, "unless you want to revise your earlier comments about my role in tonight's festivities." Viviana's jaw tightened. She was trapped between her pride and her fear, unable to apologize without admitting she had been wrong, but terrified of maintaining her position now that the power dynamics had shifted so dramatically. Daniel checked his watch with the practiced efficiency of someone who managed a complex schedule. "I really should be going soon, but I'm glad I got to meet everyone. Celeste speaks of her family often." Again, the neutral tone that could be interpreted multiple ways. Had she spoken of them fondly, critically, with concern, with warning? The ambiguity was torturous for people accustomed to reading social signals for advantage. As we prepared to leave, I looked around the ballroom one last time. The evening that had begun as a celebration of Viviana's perfect life had transformed into something else entirely, a reckoning with the reality that power in Camden Falls was about to be redistributed, and that the woman they had dismissed as an embarrassing idealist was positioned at the center of that redistribution. The real fallout, I knew, was just beginning. Daniel and I left the ballroom together, walking through the marble-floored foyer toward the valet station in comfortable silence. The contrast between the suffocating atmosphere inside and the crisp night air was almost jarring. As we waited for his car, I could see through the tall windows that the party was continuing, but the energy had fundamentally changed. Conversations appeared more urgent, more guarded. Several guests were already making their excuses and heading for the exits. "So," Daniel said quietly, his hand finding mine, "that was interesting. Want to tell me what happened before I arrived?" I looked back toward the ballroom, where my family was undoubtedly having emergency discussions about damage control and reputation management. Viviana decided to publicly announce that I was seated with the catering staff because I had volunteered to help coordinate their service. In front of 300 people, Daniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. In the 3 years I'd known him, I had learned to read the subtle signs of his anger. Unlike my family's dramatic emotional displays, Daniel's fury was controlled, focused, and far more dangerous because of its precision. "And your parents?" he asked, his voice maintaining its characteristic calm. "Said nothing, did nothing, watched it happen like it was dinner theater." The words came out more bitter than I had intended, but I was past caring about appearing gracious or understanding. Daniel nodded slowly, processing the information with the same methodical approach he brought to legal analysis. "I'm sorry you had to endure that, and I'm sorry I wasn't there to witness it firsthand." There was something in his tone that made me look at him more carefully. "Why do you sound like you're taking notes for future reference?" His smile was slight but genuine. "Because judges have long memories, and federal corruption cases often involve patterns of behavior that extend beyond just financial crimes. Character evidence can be remarkably relevant in sentencing phase." The valet brought Daniel's car around, a modest sedan that reflected his middle-class background and his commitment to avoiding any appearance of impropriety. As he held the passenger door open for me, I could see several faces pressed against the ballroom windows, watching our departure with obvious anxiety. "Where would you like to go?" he asked, as we pulled away from the estate. "Your apartment? Mine? Somewhere neutral where we can talk." I considered the options. My apartment felt too small for the magnitude of what had just happened. His place, while comfortable, was filled with case files and legal documents that would remind us both of the professional complications we were navigating. "The river overlook," I said finally. "I need space to think." Camden Falls' river overlook was a small park that provided a panoramic view of the city's skyline. At night, with the office buildings lit up and the water reflecting the lights, it was beautiful in a way that reminded you why people fought so hard to control this place. We sat on a bench facing the water, the silence between us comfortable but charged with unspoken questions. "I've compromised your position," I said finally, "by revealing our relationship tonight, in front of half the people who might end up as defendants in your courtroom." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, watching a boat move slowly down the river. "Have you, or have I been compromising yours for the past 8 months, by asking you to keep our relationship secret?" The question surprised me. "You never asked me to keep it secret." "We agreed it was the prudent thing to do." "We agreed," he corrected gently, "but I initiated that conversation. I was the one who suggested we wait to make things public until after the corruption cases were resolved. And tonight, watching those people treat you like you were disposable, I realized what that prudence has cost you." I turned to study his profile in the dim light from the park's street lamps. "What do you mean?" "I mean that by keeping our relationship quiet, I've inadvertently allowed your family to treat you as if you had no connections, no protection, no value beyond what they assign to you." His voice carried a frustration I rarely heard from him. "They felt free to humiliate you precisely because they believed you were powerless." The insight hit me like a physical blow, not because it was wrong but because it was absolutely right. My family's cruelty tonight hadn't been spontaneous, it had been calculated, based on their assessment that I had no recourse, no allies, no way to retaliate for their treatment. "So what happens now?" I asked. "Your cases, the investigations, your judicial ethics obligation." Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair in a gesture that made him look younger and less formidable. "Now I have to navigate one of the most complex ethical situations of my career. I can't recuse myself from cases just because you work in criminal defense and we happen to be engaged. That would set a precedent that could paralyze the entire judicial system. But you also can't appear to be using your position to protect me, or retaliate against people who've treated me badly," I finished. "Exactly. Which means that everything I do from this point forward will be scrutinized for any hint of personal bias or professional misconduct." He looked at me directly. "Are you prepared for that level of scrutiny? Because after tonight, every case you handle, every decision I make, every social interaction we have will be examined for conflicts of interest." The weight of his question settled over me like a heavy blanket. I had spent years fighting for clients while trying to maintain some connection to my family's world. Now I was being asked to choose not just between those worlds, but to accept that my choice would affect the man I loved and the integrity of the federal justice system. "There's something else," Daniel continued, his voice careful. "The corruption investigation isn't just about municipal contracts and zoning decisions. There's evidence suggesting some judges have been influenced in their sentencing decisions, particularly in cases involving wealthy defendants. The implication hung between us like a loaded weapon. My father, Judge Harrison Rosewood, with his carefully cultivated relationships and his patterns of leniency toward white-collar criminals, was potentially in the crosshairs of an investigation that his future son-in-law was overseeing. "How long have you known?" I asked quietly. "About your father specifically." 3 weeks. "About the broader pattern of judicial influence." "Months." Daniel's honesty was both reassuring and terrifying. "I've been trying to figure out how to handle the situation ethically. Tonight simplified things." I laughed, a sound that was equal parts humor and hysteria. "Simplified? How did tonight simplify anything?" "Because now everyone knows about our relationship. The secrecy that was protecting you from scrutiny was also protecting them from accountability. Your family and their associates felt safe to treat you badly because they thought there would be no consequences. Now they know there will be." We sat in silence for several minutes, watching the city lights reflect on the water. Camden Falls looked peaceful from this distance. Beautiful even. It was hard to imagine that beneath that serene surface was a web of corruption that Daniel was methodically unraveling. "I love you," I said finally, the words carrying more weight than they ever had before. "I love you too," he replied. "Which is why I need you to understand what you're choosing. If you stay with me, if we move forward with our engagement, you'll be subjected to investigations, background checks, media scrutiny. Your family will either cut you off completely or try to use you to get information about federal cases. Your career will be examined for any hint that you've benefited from our relationship." He paused, looking at me with an expression that was equal parts love and professional concern. "And some of the people you grew up with, people who were at that party tonight, are going to prison, including possibly members of your own family." The choice he was offering wasn't really a choice at all. I could have the man I loved and the chance to see justice served, but I would lose everything else. My family, my social connections, the comfortable safety net I had always known existed even when I chose not to use it. Or I could walk away from Daniel, preserve my family relationships, and spend the rest of my life knowing I had chosen comfort over justice, familiarity over love. As I sat there looking out over the city that had shaped me, the decision crystallized with surprising clarity. I had already made my choice the moment I stood up from that staff table and walked toward my family with my phone in my hand. I was just finally ready to live with the consequence. The retaliation began at 6:47 a.m. the next morning with a phone call from my supervisor at the public defender's office. Linda Morrison had been my boss for 3 years, and I had never heard her voice carry the particular combination of confusion, concern, and barely contained anger that came through my phone as I fumbled to answer it. "Celeste, I need you in my office immediately," she said without preamble, "and bring whatever documentation you have regarding your relationship with federal Judge Daniel Cross." I sat up in bed, instantly awake despite having gotten less than 3 hours of sleep. "Linda, what's happening?" "What's happening is that I've received calls from the State Bar Association, the Judicial Ethics Committee, and 3 different reporters since 5:30 this morning, all asking about potential conflicts of interest involving one of my public defenders and a federal judge overseeing corruption cases." Her voice was tight with the strain of someone who had been ambushed by a crisis she didn't understand. "So I'm asking you directly, is there any truth to suggestions that you've been in a romantic relationship with Judge Cross while handling cases that could potentially come under federal review?" The attack was more sophisticated than I had expected. Instead of coming directly at Daniel or me, they were targeting the structural integrity of both our professional positions. By raising questions about conflicts of interest, they were forcing us to defend not just our relationship but our professional ethics. "I'll be there in an hour," I said, already getting out of bed and reaching for clothes. "And Lynn, you might want to prepare for this to get much worse before it gets better." The drive to my office took me through downtown Camden Falls, past the federal courthouse where Daniel was probably already preparing for the day's proceeding. The morning news was playing on my car radio, and I wasn't surprised to hear the lead story: questions raised about federal judge relationship with local defense attorney. The reporter's voice was professionally neutral, but the implications were clear. Anonymous sources were suggesting that my relationship with Daniel represented a fundamental conflict of interest that could compromise both federal corruption investigations and the integrity of local criminal defense work. The story was careful to avoid direct accusations, but it painted a picture of two legal professionals who had potentially violated ethical boundaries. When I arrived at the public defender's office, I could see the media circus beginning to form. Two news vans were parked across the street, and I recognized the investigative reporter from Channel 7 setting up for what was clearly going to be a live broadcast. The message was obvious. This story was going to dominate the news. Linda's office felt smaller than usual with the weight of crisis hanging in the air. She gestured for me to sit, then handed me a stack of printouts that represented the morning's media coverage and official inquiry. "Explain this to me," she said, her tone suggesting that my explanation better be good, because right now, it looks like one of my attorneys has been romantically involved with a federal judge while we've been handling cases that could potentially overlap with his jurisdiction. I scanned the documents quickly, recognizing the sophisticated nature of the attack. Someone had done their homework, identifying every case I had handled in the past year that involved white-collar crime, municipal corruption, or defendants with connections to Camden Falls business community. They had then cross-referenced those cases with Daniel's federal investigation, creating a paper trail that suggested potential conflicts even where none existed. "Linda, every single one of these cases was resolved months before Daniel and I even met," I said, pointing to the timeline they had constructed, "and the ones that are still pending involve street-level drug charges that have absolutely nothing to do with federal corruption investigation." "That's not the point, and you know it," Linda replied, her frustration evident. "The point is that the appearance of impropriety is almost as damaging as actual impropriety. If there's even a suggestion that your personal relationship might have influenced your professional decisions, it calls into question every case you've handled." She was right, and we both knew it. In the legal profession, reputation and credibility were everything. Even unfounded accusations could destroy careers, and the people behind this attack understood that perfectly. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "This is just the beginning. Drop the relationship, or watch both your careers burn." I showed the message to Linda, whose expression darkened further. "Celeste, I need to ask you directly, is there any possibility that your relationship with Judge Cross has influenced your work here? Any cases where you might have made decisions based on information you received from him, or where you might have advocated for outcomes that could benefit his investigations?" The question was both insulting and necessary. Linda had to ask it to protect both the office and herself, but hearing it out loud made the attack's effectiveness crystal clear. They weren't just questioning my ethics, they were forcing everyone around me to question them as well. "Absolutely not," I said firmly. "Daniel and I have been scrupulously careful to avoid any situation where our professional responsibilities might conflict. We don't discuss our cases, we don't share information, and we've never allowed our personal relationship to influence our professional decisions." Linda nodded, but I could see the wheels turning in her mind. She was calculating risks, considering political ramifications, trying to figure out how to protect an office that depended on public trust and political support. "The problem," she said finally, "is that being careful isn't enough anymore. The mere existence of your relationship is now being used to undermine confidence in both federal corruption investigations and local criminal defense work. Someone is playing a very sophisticated game, and they're using you and Judge Cross as pawns." Before I could respond, Linda's assistant knocked and entered with a concerned expression. "There's someone here from the State Bar Association's Ethics Committee. They're requesting an immediate interview with Celeste regarding potential conflicts of interest." The speed of the response was breathtaking. Less than 12 hours after Daniel had walked into that ballroom, a coordinated campaign was already in motion to destroy both our careers. This wasn't the panicked reaction of guilty parties. This was the calculated response of people who had contingency plans for exactly this scenario. My phone rang again, and I recognized Daniel's number. "I need to take this," I told Linda, who nodded grimly. "Celeste, are you seeing the news coverage?" Daniel's voice was controlled, but I could hear the tension underneath. "I'm living it," I replied. State Bar Association is here to interview me about ethics violations. Judicial Ethics Committee has requested a formal review of my conduct. They're also questioning whether I should recuse myself from the corruption cases. He paused. Someone leaked details about the investigation timeline that aren't public record. This isn't just about attacking us personally. They're trying to derail the entire federal case. The scope of what we were facing began to crystallize. This wasn't just retaliation for embarrassing powerful people at a social event. This was a coordinated effort to neutralize a federal corruption investigation by destroying the credibility of the judge overseeing it, and the defense attorney whose work had helped expose some of the patterns the investigation was following. Daniel, if you recuse yourself, do the cases get reassigned to a judge who might be more sympathetic to the defendants? Potentially. Judge Arthur Manning is next in rotation, and he's known for his narrow interpretation of corruption statutes. A lot of cases that might result in convictions under my review could be dismissed or legal bargained down to minor charges under his. The chess game was becoming clearer. By forcing Daniel to recuse himself, they could potentially escape serious consequences for their corruption. By destroying my credibility, they could undermine the patterns of evidence that had helped federal investigators understand how the system worked. So, what do we do? I asked. Daniel's answer was immediate and decisive. We fight back. But Celeste, you need to understand, they're just getting started. If they're willing to go this far, this fast, they have more ammunition prepared. Are you ready for whatever comes next? Looking around Linda's office, seeing the stress and concern on her face, understanding that my colleagues were about to be subjected to intense scrutiny because of their association with me, I felt the full weight of what we were up against. But I also felt something else, a crystalline clarity about who the real criminals were in this scenario. The people trying to destroy us weren't victims defending themselves. They were guilty parties using their power and connections to escape accountability. I'm ready, I told Daniel. But next time, we don't wait for them to attack. Next time, we take the offensive. The counterattack began with a phone call I made from my car in the public defender's office parking lot, while news crews waited across the street like vultures circling a carcass. I scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I was looking for. FBI Special Agent Sarah Chen, the lead investigator on Daniel's corruption cases. Agent Chen and I had worked together on 3 cases over the past 2 years. Situations where local criminal defense work had uncovered patterns that warranted federal attention. She was brilliant, methodical, and absolutely incorruptible. More importantly, she understood how Camden Falls' power structure operated and wouldn't be surprised by the coordinated attack we were facing. Agent Chen, it's Celeste Rosewood. I need to report what I believe is an ongoing conspiracy to obstruct federal justice. Her response was immediate and professional. Ms. Rosewood, I've been monitoring the news coverage this morning. Are you suggesting that the ethics complaints and media attention are connected to the federal investigation? I'm suggesting that someone with access to confidential information about your investigation's timeline has orchestrated a campaign to force Judge Cross's recusal and discredit key witness testimony, I said, watching another news van pull up across the street. The speed and coordination of this response isn't possible without advanced planning and inside knowledge. There was a pause as Agent Chen processed the implications. Can you be more specific about what you're alleging? I took a deep breath, knowing that what I was about to say would irrevocably escalate the situation. Someone leaked details about the federal investigation timeline that aren't public record. The ethics complaints were filed simultaneously across multiple jurisdictions. The media received coordinated talking points that suggest a unified source. And I've received direct threats to abandon my relationship with Judge Cross or face career destruction. Ms. Rosewood, I need you to preserve all communications you've received, including that threat. Don't delete anything. Don't respond to any unknown numbers, and don't discuss this conversation with anyone except Judge Cross and your attorney. Agent Chen's tone had shifted from professional courtesy to active investigation mode. I also need you to document everything you remember about last night's engagement party. Who was there? What conversations you overheard? Any reactions when Judge Cross was introduced? Someone in that room likely coordinated this morning's response. After ending the call with Agent Chen, I sat in my car for a moment, watching the media circus across the street and considering my next move. The old Celeste would have tried to wait this out, hoping the storm would pass if she kept her head down. But the woman who had stood up at that staff table last night was done playing defense. I called Daniel next, knowing he was probably in his office dealing with his own crisis management. Sarah Chen is treating this as potential obstruction of justice, I told him without preamble. She wants us to document everything from last night and preserve all communications we've received today. Good, Daniel said, his voice carrying a grim satisfaction. Because I've been doing some research of my own this morning. The timing of these ethics complaints isn't just suspicious. It's impossible unless someone had advanced knowledge of our relationship and prepared responses. He paused, and I could hear papers shuffling in the background. Celeste, the judicial ethics complaint against me was filed at 6:15 this morning. But it references specific aspects of our relationship that were never made public last night. Someone knew details about us that they could only have obtained through surveillance or inside information. The implications were staggering. They've been watching us, for weeks at minimum, possibly months. Daniel's anger was carefully controlled but unmistakable. Which means this conspiracy to obstruct justice has been ongoing long before last night's revelation. Your family's treatment of you wasn't just social cruelty, it was part of a broader strategy to keep us separated and discredited. I thought back to the past few months, remembering times when I had felt like I was being watched, moments when conversations had seemed to shift when I entered rooms, occasions when family members had asked unusually specific questions about my work schedule and personal life. Daniel, I think my family has been feeding them information, not just about us, but about my cases, my clients, anything that could be used to discredit me or interfere with your investigation. My phone buzzed with an incoming call from my mother. I let it go to voicemail, then immediately received a text. Celeste, we need to talk. This situation can still be managed if you're reasonable. I showed the message to Daniel during our call. They're still trying to control the narrative, he observed, which suggests they think they can minimize the damage if they can get you to cooperate with whatever story they're selling. What do you think they want? Probably for you to publicly distance yourself from me, maybe claim the relationship was exaggerated or misunderstood. If they can portray last night as a misunderstanding rather than a revelation, they might be able to contain the investigation's scope. I looked across the street at the growing media presence, then at the text from my mother suggesting this could all be managed with my cooperation. The choice was crystallizing. I could help my family minimize their exposure, or I could help federal investigators maximize their accountability. I'm going to call a press conference, I said suddenly, the decision forming as I spoke. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Celeste, that's incredibly risky. Once you go public, there's no taking it back, and they'll come at you with everything they have. They're already coming at me with everything they have, I pointed out. But right now, they're controlling the narrative. They're making this about ethics violations and conflicts of interest instead of about corruption and obstruction of justice. I could practically hear Daniel thinking through the legal and strategic implications. What would you say? The truth that I'm a public defender who has been engaged to federal Judge Daniel Cross for 8 months, that we've been scrupulously careful to avoid any conflicts of interest, that last night my family publicly humiliated me by seating me with hired staff and announcing it as my choice to serve, rather than participate as family. I paused, gathering my thoughts, and that within 12 hours of Judge Cross meeting my family and their associates, a coordinated campaign began to destroy both our careers using information that could only have been obtained through surveillance or inside sources. You're essentially accusing some of Camden Falls' most powerful people of conspiracy to obstruct federal justice, Daniel pointed out. I'm stating facts and letting people draw their own conclusions, I corrected. But yes, that's exactly what I'm doing. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice carried a mix of admiration and concern. If you do this, they'll try to destroy everything about you. Your past, your relationships, your professional competence. They'll dig up every mistake you've ever made and amplify it. Are you prepared for that level of scrutiny? I thought about the question seriously. My past wasn't perfect. I had made mistakes, had cases I'd handled poorly, had moments of professional and personal doubt, but I had also spent years fighting for people who couldn't fight for themselves, representing defendants who deserved competent counsel regardless of their ability to pay. I'm prepared, I said finally. But more importantly, I'm tired of letting other people define who I am and what I'm worth. Last night, my family tried to turn me into a servant in front of 300 people. This morning, anonymous sources are trying to turn me into an unethical lawyer. I'm done letting other people write my story. Within an hour, I was standing in front of the public defender's office, facing a bank of cameras and reporters who had expected to witness my humiliation. Instead, they were about to hear me take control of my own narrative for the first time in my life. Linda Morrison stood beside me, having made the decision to support her attorney despite the political risks. Agent Chen was watching from an unmarked vehicle across the street. Daniel was monitoring from his office, ready to coordinate our response with whatever came next. As I approached the microphones, I realized that this moment represented more than just a professional crisis or a personal relationship. This was about whether justice in Camden Falls would be determined by federal law, or by the preferences of people wealthy enough to orchestrate coordinated attacks on anyone who threatened their power. The old system had protected itself by making people like me afraid to speak truth to power, but they had miscalculated something fundamental. I was no longer afraid of them. I was angry at them, and anger, I was about to discover, was a much more powerful weapon than fear. Standing before those cameras, I delivered a statement that was simultaneously personal and professional, carefully crafted to avoid legal pitfalls while making the conspiracy's scope unmistakably clear. I spoke about professional ethics, about the difference between appearance and reality, and about the coordinated nature of attacks designed to obstruct federal justice investigation. But what resonated most with viewers wasn't my legal analysis. It was the raw honesty when I described being seated with hired staff at my own sister's engagement party, and how that humiliation had been orchestrated to keep me isolated and powerless. I want to be clear about what happened last night, I said, looking directly into the cameras. I was publicly humiliated by my own family in front of 300 witnesses because they believed I had no recourse, no protection, and no power to respond. What they didn't know was that the man they were trying to separate me from is Federal Judge Daniel Cross, who has been investigating corruption in this city for months. The effect was immediate and electric. By the time I finished speaking, my phone was buzzing constantly with calls from reporters, legal analysts, and federal investigators. But more importantly, other phones around Camden Falls were ringing too, phones belonging to people who suddenly realized they were in much more trouble than they had anticipated. The first domino fell at 2:47 p.m. when William Cromwell, the construction contractor who had criticized my idealism at the engagement party, voluntarily appeared at the FBI field office with his attorney. Agent Chen later told me that Cromwell had spent the morning calculating his exposure and decided that cooperation was preferable to prosecution. Cromwell's information was devastating. He provided details about a bid-rigging scheme that involved municipal contracts worth millions of dollars, coordinated through social events and charity functions, where the real business was conducted in private conversation. He named names, provided dates, and offered to wear a wire for future meetings, but Cromwell's most damaging revelation concerned the surveillance operation that had been monitoring Daniel and me for months. According to his statement, a private investigation firm had been hired to document our relationship, our schedules, and our professional activities. The goal was to gather ammunition for exactly the kind of coordinated attack we had faced that morning. The second domino fell when Amanda Sterling, the psychiatrist who had pathologized my career choices at the party, received a visit from federal agents, asking about her involvement in spreading coordinated talking points about my mental fitness. Sterling's professional license was already under review for unrelated patient confidentiality violations, and she couldn't afford additional scrutiny. Her cooperation revealed the sophisticated nature of the retaliation campaign. A WhatsApp group called Crisis Management had been created immediately after Daniel left the engagement party, including my parents, Viviana, Theodore, several Ashworth family members, and a dozen other prominent Camden Falls figures. The group had coordinated their response throughout the night, sharing talking points, planning media strategy, and organizing the ethics complaints that had been filed at dawn. But the most shocking revelation came from Sterling's phone records, which showed coordination with James Hartwell, the white-collar defense attorney who had disappeared from the party early. Hartwell, it turned out, had been operating as an informal coordinator for what amounted to a conspiracy to obstruct federal justice. By 4 p.m., the FBI had executed search warrants for Hartwell's offices, seizing files that documented not just the immediate conspiracy, but years of coordination between Camden Falls' legal, political, and business communities. The files revealed a network of mutual protection that had operated through social connections, charitable donations, and carefully orchestrated legal strategy. Judge Margaret Fairchild was arrested at 5:23 p.m., charged with conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and violation of federal civil rights under color of law. The evidence against her included recorded conversations about case outcomes, financial records showing payments through intermediary accounts, and documented patterns of sentencing disparities that benefited specific defendants. The most damaging evidence came from Fairchild's own records, which showed she had been briefed about Daniel's investigation weeks before it became public. Her judicial calendar had been strategically adjusted to ensure that certain cases were resolved before federal oversight could intervene. Senator Blackstone was taken into custody at his campaign office at 6:15 p.m., charged with conspiracy and federal program fraud related to infrastructure contracts. His arrest was particularly dramatic because it occurred during a live television interview where he was denying any knowledge of corruption in Camden Falls. Mayor Willis, recognizing the inevitable, negotiated a cooperation agreement through her attorney. Her information revealed the scope of the municipal corruption, including zoning decisions that had been influenced by contributions to specific charities, regulatory enforcement that had been selectively applied based on political connection, public contracts that had been awarded through processes designed to appear competitive while ensuring predetermined outcomes. But the arrest that resonated most powerfully throughout Camden Falls came at 7:42 p.m., when FBI agents appeared at the Rosewood estate with warrants for my father, Judge Harrison Rosewood. The charges against my father were extensive: conspiracy to obstruct justice, violation of federal civil rights under color of law, money laundering through charitable organizations, and racketeering conspiracy. The evidence included recorded conversations from the engagement party, financial records showing payments through complex trust structures, and documented coordination with other defendants. Perhaps most damaging were my father's own judicial records, which showed patterns of sentencing that had protected members of the conspiracy, while ensuring harsh penalties for defendants who might have been willing to cooperate with federal investigators. The psychological impact of seeing my father arrested was complex and painful. This was the man who had taught me about justice, who had encouraged my interest in law, who had seemed to embody judicial integrity. But the evidence was overwhelming. He had been a central figure in a conspiracy that had corrupted the very system he had sworn to protect. Viviana and Theodore were arrested the following morning, charged with conspiracy and obstruction of justice for their roles in coordinating the retaliation campaign. The irony wasn't lost on me that my sister, who had seated me with the hired help to demonstrate my powerlessness, was now facing federal charges that could result in decades in prison. Mrs. Ashworth was charged as well. Her role in coordinating the surveillance and media campaign, documented through phone records and financial transactions, the shipping fortune that had seemed so secure was now subject to federal asset forfeiture proceedings. By the end of the week, 47 people had been arrested or indicted in what federal prosecutors were calling the largest municipal corruption case in state history. The conspiracy had reached into every aspect of Camden Falls's power structure: the courts, city government, major businesses, and even charitable organizations that had been used to launder payments and coordinate activities. The personal cost was devastating but clarifying. I had lost my family, my social connections, and the comfortable safety net I had always known existed, but I had gained something more valuable, the knowledge that justice was possible, even when it required dismantling the very systems that had shaped my life. Daniel remained on the case after a judicial ethics review determined that our relationship hadn't influenced his professional decisions, and that recusal would actually serve the interests of the conspiracy, rather than justice. His handling of the cases was scrupulous and fair, but the evidence was so overwhelming that most defendants eventually accepted plea agreements rather than face trial. The transformation of Camden Falls was swift and comprehensive. New leadership emerged in city government, the courts, and major businesses. Reform candidates won elections previously dominated by established families. The culture of corruption that had operated through social connections and mutual protection was replaced by transparency requirements and external oversight. But perhaps the most significant change was personal. I was no longer the woman who had sat silently at a staff table, accepting humiliation because I feared the consequences of resistance. I had become someone who understood that real power came not from social connections or inherited wealth, but from the courage to demand accountability from those who believed themselves untouchable. 2 years later, I stood in the same ballroom where my sister had once humiliated me, but everything had changed. The Rosewood estate had been sold to satisfy federal restitution requirements, and the new owners had transformed it into a community justice center, where chandeliers had once cast shadows over whispered corruption deals. Fluorescent lights now illuminated legal aid clinics, victim advocacy programs, and courtrooms dedicated to restorative justice. I was there for the ribbon-cutting ceremony, not as the embarrassing family member hidden in the corner, but as the newly appointed Director of Criminal Justice Reform for the state. The governor had created the position specifically for me, recognizing that someone who had witnessed corruption from the inside was uniquely qualified to prevent it from taking root again. Daniel stood beside me, no longer just my fiancé but my husband of 14 months. Our wedding had been small but meaningful, attended by fellow public defenders, federal agents, reform advocates, and the former defendants whose cases had provided evidence for the corruption investigation. The guest list reflected our values rather than social obligations, and every person there had earned their place through character rather than connection. "You know," Daniel said quietly as we watched community members touring the new facilities, "when I walked into that engagement party 2 years ago, I never imagined it would lead to this." I smiled, thinking about the woman I had been that night, desperate for family acceptance, willing to tolerate humiliation, believing that keeping my head down was the safest path forward. That version of myself felt like a different person entirely. "I'm grateful it happened exactly the way it did," I replied. "If they had just been coldly polite instead of publicly cruel, I might have stayed silent for years longer." Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you is actually the best thing, because it forces you to choose who you really want to be. The transformation of Camden Falls had been more comprehensive than anyone had anticipated. The federal corruption cases had resulted in 43 convictions, with sentences ranging from probation for minor participants to 25 years for the ringleaders. But more importantly, the exposure of the conspiracy had created space for genuine reform. New judges had been appointed through merit-based processes rather than political connections. City council meetings were now live-streamed with full financial disclosure requirements. Major municipal contracts required independent oversight and competitive bidding with transparent scoring criteria. The culture of backroom deals and mutual protection had been replaced by accountability and public engagement. My father had received 15 years in federal prison after refusing a plea agreement that would have required admitting the full scope of his corruption. He maintained his innocence even as evidence mounted, preferring to see himself as a victim of an overzealous prosecution rather than acknowledge his role in perverting justice. We hadn't spoken since his sentencing, and I had made peace with the likelihood that we never would. Viviana had accepted a plea agreement that resulted in 3 years in federal prison and 5 years of supervised release. She had written to me once from prison, a letter that was equal parts apology and accusation, suggesting that I could have prevented her downfall by keeping my relationship with Daniel secret. I hadn't responded, recognizing that she still saw me as responsible for the consequences of her own choices. The personal costs had been significant, but not devastating. Losing my family of origin had been painful, but it had also been liberating. I no longer carried the burden of trying to earn approval from people whose values fundamentally contradicted my own. Instead, I had built a chosen family of colleagues, friends, and allies who shared my commitment to justice and reform. My work as Director of Criminal Justice Reform had evolved beyond what I had imagined possible as a public defender. I now oversaw programs that addressed systemic inequalities, coordinated with federal investigators to prevent corruption, and developed policies that prioritized rehabilitation over punishment. The position allowed me to influence the entire criminal justice system rather than just individual cases. But perhaps the most meaningful change was in how I understood power itself. For years I had believed that power meant social connections, family wealth, and institutional protection. The corruption conspiracy had operated on exactly those assumptions, that relationships and money could overcome law and accountability. What I had learned was that real power came from something entirely different: the willingness to speak truth, regardless of consequences, the courage to choose principles over convenience, and the strength to stand alone when standing together meant compromising your value. The evening's keynote speaker was Dr. Maya Thompson, a criminal justice reform advocate, whose work on restorative justice had influenced policy nationwide. As she spoke about the importance of systemic change and individual courage, I found myself thinking about all the people who had played essential roles in Camden Falls' transformation. Agent Sarah Chen had been promoted to lead the FBI's public corruption unit for the entire region, her success in unraveling the Camden Falls conspiracy serving as a model for investigations in other cities. Linda Morrison had been appointed as a state court judge, her integrity and commitment to justice earning bipartisan support. Even Maria, the server who had apologized to me that terrible night at the engagement party, had benefited from the changes. She was now studying for her nursing degree, through a scholarship program funded by restitution payments from the corruption cases. Each of these stories reinforced something I had come to understand. Systems change when individuals choose to act with courage, and individual courage becomes contagious when people see that standing up to power can actually work. As the ceremony concluded and guests began to mingle, I noticed a young woman standing alone near the back of the room. She was well-dressed but uncomfortable, her body language suggesting someone who felt out of place despite having every right to be there. Something about her reminded me of myself 2 years ago. I approached her with a smile. "I'm Celeste Cross. I don't think we've met." She looked surprised to be addressed by someone she clearly recognized from news coverage. "I'm Jennifer Walsh. I'm a paralegal at Morrison & Associates. Judge Morrison suggested I attend tonight, but I'm not sure I belong here." I studied her more carefully, recognizing the signs of someone wrestling with a difficult decision. "Are you working on something that's troubling you?" Jennifer glanced around nervously, then leaned close. "I think I've discovered evidence of witness intimidation in a case my firm is handling, but the people involved they're connected, important. If I report what I've found, it could destroy my career before it even starts." The moment felt like déjà vu, but with a crucial difference. 2 years ago, I had been the young woman afraid to speak up. Tonight, I was the person she needed to meet, someone who had faced that same choice and could show her that courage was possible. "Jennifer," I said, pulling out one of my business cards, "would you like to have coffee tomorrow? I have some experience with situations like the one you're describing, and I'd be happy to discuss your options." Her relief was immediate and visible. "You would do that, even though you don't know me?" I smiled, thinking about all the people who had helped me find my courage when I needed it most. Someone did the same thing for me once. It's how change happens, one person at a time, one choice at a time. As I watched Jennifer's posture straighten with newfound hope, I realized that this was what victory actually looked like. Not just the dramatic arrests or the institutional reforms, but the quiet moment when someone decides to choose courage over comfort, truth over convenience, justice over self-preservation. That's what I want you to understand from my story. Real change doesn't happen through grand gestures or perfect heroes. It happens when ordinary people, People like you and me decide that we're tired of accepting what we know is wrong, even when speaking up feels impossible. Maybe you're sitting at your own version of the staff table right now feeling powerless and invisible. Maybe you're being told that you don't belong, that your voice doesn't matter, that you should be grateful for whatever scraps of respect you receive. I want you to know that you have more power than you realize. Your voice matters, your truth matters, and somewhere out there, someone needs to see you stand up so they can find the courage to do the same. The question isn't whether you're brave enough to change the world. The question is whether you're brave enough to change your own life. Because when you do that, when you refuse to accept being diminished, when you demand the respect you deserve, when you choose truth over convenience, you give permission for everyone around you to do the same. So let me ask you, what's your staff table? What situation are you tolerating because speaking up feels too risky? What truth are you not telling because you're afraid of the consequence? Drop a comment and tell me about a time when you had to choose between keeping the peace and standing up for yourself. Or share this story with someone who needs to hear that their voice matters, that they deserve better, and that speaking truth to power isn't just possible, it's necessary. Because at the end of the day, the people who try to keep you silent are counting on your fear. They're betting that you'll choose comfort over courage, that you'll protect their power rather than claim your own. Don't let them win that bet. Stand up, speak up. Your voice is more powerful than you know. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.